Hello and welcome to the Military History Club's Great Battle in 10 Minutes feature. Today I'm talking about the Battle of Anwal, which took place on the 22nd of July 1921 in northeast Morocco when a large Spanish army was routed by a force of Rif tribesmen a fraction of its size. It was one of the worst defeats of a modern army by untrained troops in the history of war, and in no small part was due to the abject defeatism shown by the Spanish soldiers and their officers. At the turn of the 20th century, both France and Spain had been casting covetous eyes towards Morocco, one of the few African states to have avoided colonization. But France had one major advantage. She was still a great power, whereas Spain had long since relinquished that status. This fact was confirmed by the Anglo-French Entente of 1904, which gave France a free hand in Morocco in return for an undertaking not to interfere with British plans in Egypt. Spain's agreement was secured by a French promise that North Morocco would be treated as a Spanish sphere of influence. When Morocco became a French protectorate in 1912, this arrangement was confirmed. In effect, Spain was given control over a strip of northern Morocco, about 1/10 of the whole country. It included the Mediterranean ports of Quetta and Melilla, which Spain had held for centuries, and the iron mines of the Rif Mountains. Inevitably, Spanish capital became interested in exploiting these natural resources. But first, the rugged and unmapped interior, peopled by fierce, independent tribes, would have to be pacified. The man given the task of extending Spanish rule into the central Rif was Major General General Silvestre, a ladies' man and favourite of King Alfonso XIII, and whose soldierly qualities included having been wounded no fewer than 16 times during the Spanish-American War of 1898. Having set out from Melilla with an army of 20,000 Spaniards and 5,000 native regulares in late 1919, he proceeded to conquer more territory in 18 months than had been won in the previous 12 years. By May 1921, he had pushed forward his posts more than 80 miles west of Melilla. They stretched from Sidi Driss on the coast, over the mountains, through Anwal, and south to Zoco el Telata, 35 miles inland. The bulk of his army, about 14,000 men in all, was encamped around the fort at Anwal, set in a lush valley surrounded by high ground. The remaining troops were manning a chain of forts and blockhouses that stretched back to Melilla. Part of Silvestre's early success can be put down to the fact that a series of poor harvests had forced many Rif tribesmen to seek work in Algeria. Now they returned and swelled the ranks of those tribes eager to resist Silvestre's advance. None was more implacable than the Beni Urigel, led by Abd el-Krim. Born in the tribal stronghold of Algiers in 1882, the son of a schoolteacher, el-Krim had been educated at a Spanish school in Melilla and later became the editor of El Telegrama El Rif. He had also served for a time in the Bureau of Native Affairs and there learned about the Spanish plans to exploit the mineral potential of the Rif. Foolish enough to suggest that Spain should come to some arrangement with a new Rifian state, he was imprisoned in August 1917. On his release in late 1918, he returned to his tribal lands to raise a force that could defeat the Spanish. This was no easy task, given the fact that the Rifian tribes had no history of fighting together as a unit. They were more used to fighting each other. But by the spring of 1921, he had managed to weld together a potent fighting machine. While most of el-Krim's warriors were from the Beni Urigel, the neighbouring tribes were also represented. The Muslim Rifians also had the advantage of a cause. They would be fighting a jihad, a holy war, against the infidel invaders. The Spanish had no such motivation. Far from it. Their conscript troops were of a quality among the lowest in Europe, with more than 80% illiterate. They were badly trained and poorly equipped, many with rifles more than 20 years old. An investigation of one unit found that 19 out of 30 guns were in such bad condition they could not fire a bullet more than 100 yards. Pay was less than a third of what the tribesmen got for road building, and the ordinary soldiers in Morocco were forced to subsist on coffee, beans, rice and bread. Barracks and hospitals were filthy, and losses from malaria were high. Little wonder that they would do anything to avoid active service, eating tobacco to stimulate jaundice, or applying nettles to minor wounds to make them fester. Their officers did little to alleviate these hardships. Incompetent and undisciplined, many sold army stores to supplement their meagre pay, and spent much of their time away from their garrisons, gambling and whoring in Melilla. Hardly surprising then that the morale of the Spanish army was at rock bottom. Silvestre seemed blissfully unaware of his weakness. On being told of el-Krim's warning that any attempt by the Spanish to cross the el-Krim river would be resisted, he remarked, "I'm not going to take seriously the threats of a little Berber Said, whom I had at my mercy a short while ago. His insolence merits a new punishment." Having built up his supplies, Silvestre intended to cross the river and push further west through the defile beneath Mount Abaran. But first, to secure the passage of the defile and guard the entrance to the valley, he constructed a fort on Abaran and manned it with 500 soldiers. It was this act that provoked el-Krim to attack. During the night of the 31st of May, he and a small band of men scaled the peak and took the fort by storm. It was all over in 30 minutes. When the Spaniards at Annual realized what was going on, they dispatched a relief force, but it was driven back by the fire from the captured Spanish cannons. On hearing the news, General Berenguer, the High Commissioner, sailed from Quetta and met Silvestre on board his ship off Sidi Driss on the 5th of June. There, Silvestre tried to convince him that the loss of the fort was a minor setback, but Berenguer feared a widespread revolt and told Silvestre not to advance any further into the Rif. A violent argument ensued, during which Silvestre attempted to throttle the High Commissioner and had to be restrained by his staff officers. A breathless Berenguer then left under the impression that his instructions would be carried out. El-Krim, meanwhile, was busy trying to encourage other Rif tribes to join the revolt. "O Muslims," he told them, "we have wanted to make peace with Spain, but Spain does not want it. She only wants to occupy our lands in order to take our property and our women and to make us abandon our religion. Do not expect anything good of Spain. The Quran says, 'He who dies in holy war goes to glory.'" The result was that the neighbouring tribes rose, swelling his Harka to more than 3,000 men. On the 15th of July, these warriors took up positions on a stretch of high ground at the southwest end of the Annual Valley. Silvestre responded by sending troops to occupy Iguereben, a low hill 4 miles to the south. It was an unfortunate choice. As it was also 3 miles from the nearest water supply, it would need to be revictualled over an area of rocky terrain through which ran a deep gully. On the 17th of July, el-Krim's men dug in on the high ground between the 2 Spanish outposts. The following day, Major Benitez, the commander at Iguereben, heliographed that he was short of water. 2 attempts to reach the stream in the gully had failed, driven back by tribesmen who had surrounded the outpost. A relief force would be sent the following day, he was told. At dawn on the 19th, 3 columns set off from Annual, each of 1,000 men. The entrenched Riffians allowed the Spanish to get within 200 yards of their position before they opened fire. "The bullets flew like grain," wrote el-Krim in his memoirs. At first the Spaniards wavered, then they came on again. But the storm of fire was too great and they eventually withdrew, having lost 152 men in 2 hours. That afternoon, Silvestre, who had arrived at Annual from Sidi Driss, radioed to Berenguer for reinforcements. Replying that there were none available, Berenguer advised him to remain on the defensive. The Iguereben garrison made 2 attempts to reach the stream and the gully on the 20th. Both were unsuccessful. Desperate with thirst, its men had been reduced to drinking the juice from tomato tins, then vinegar, cologne, ink, and finally sweetened urine. On the 21st of July, Silvestre made one last attempt to reach Iguereben with a force of 3,000 men. But again the Riffian fire was too hot. When the smoke cleared, the Spaniards could be seen streaming back towards Annual, many having thrown away their weapons. Watching the debark from the parapet of the fort at Annual, Silvestre seemed to lose his head. First, he sent a heliograph message ordering Benitez to surrender the garrison, but Benitez refused, saying he would rather die. Then he sent a final message: abandon the post and fall back on Anwal. In an attempt to do so, Benitez and most of his garrison were hacked to death. Of the 25 men who did make it back to Anwal, 16 died soon afterwards of dehydration and exhaustion. Silvestre now began to panic. The camp at Anwal was in a bad location, overlooked by surrounding hills, and his men displaying little stomach for the fight. During the afternoon of the 21st, as the Riffians turned their attention towards Anwal, Silvestre called his officers to a council of war. Ammunition was short, and most were of the opinion that to hold on was pointless. Silvestre agreed and sent a final telegram to Melilla at 4:55 a.m. on the 22nd of June, announcing his intention to withdraw to Ben Tib. He then ordered a general retreat. But the shock of such order seemed to have snapped the already low morale of the conscript troops. Instead of retiring in good order, they broke and ran, throwing away their equipment and weapons as they went. Hundreds were shot and hacked to death by the waiting Riffians. Silvestre, who at the last minute decided not to abandon Anwal, is said to have shouted after his panicking troops, "Run, run, the bogeyman is coming." Eventually the fort was taken and many of the inhabitants massacred, among them Silvestre. 800 others were taken prisoner. Riffian has it that Silvestre was chopped to pieces and scattered to the wind. Another version is that el-Krim personally cut off his head and had it carried through the mountains as proof of the Riffian victory. Whichever account is true, the body was never found. As the handful of survivors reached the outposts to the rear and news of the catastrophe spread, other tribes joined in the rebellion and the chain of Spanish forts collapsed like dominoes. Many were evacuated long before they were threatened. Those that did try to make a stand were soon overwhelmed by the rebels and sometimes by their own deserters. Everyone that could, soldiers and civilians, fled towards Melilla, leaving the wounded and sick at the mercy of the bloodthirsty tribesmen. About 3,000 survivors were rallied at Das Drias by General Navarro, Silvestre's second in command. Harried by rebels as he fell back along the single dirt road, he refused to abandon the wounded and was forced to take refuge in the old fort at Monte Arruet. But again the water supply was outside the perimeter and the defenders were tormented by thirst. On the 9th of August, Monte Arruet, the last surviving fort outside Melilla, fell to the tribesmen. Navarro had agreed to a formal surrender, but as soon as the gates were opened, the Riffians poured into the fort and slaughtered most of the defenders. Navarro and 600 men were spared. Although only 20 miles away, the garrison at Melilla made no attempt to relieve Monte Arruet. Just 1,800 strong and of doubtful fighting quality, it could not have accomplished much. In any case, the heights of Gurugú, which dominated the city, were swarming with rebels. The Riffians did eventually penetrate the outskirts of the city, causing the 40,000 inhabitants to flee in terror onto boats or inside the old fortified town, but they went no further. Without cannon, an assault against the old fortress would have been costly for the attackers. In any case, the harvest was due, and the tribesmen were anxious to return to their land with their booty. As one grizzled warrior put it, the Riffians were simply bored with cutting throats. By the middle of August, el-Krim's army had melted into the interior. Following his victory, Abd el-Krim proclaimed the Republic of the Rif. It would last just 5 years, and it took a combined Franco-Spanish force of 250,000 men to subdue el-Krim. In May 1926, he surrendered to the French and was exiled. Spanish rule in the region continued until the French granted Morocco its independence in 1956.